Great. So here we are. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon to all of our panelists, our moderator, our webinar and Facebook attendees. And thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation. We at Fourth Space are very pleased actually to facilitate the kind of fruitful conversations that emerge when you give time and space and really reflection to questions that are all too often obscured. So we encourage you not only to listen in today, but also to participate in the discussion via the Q&A option in the webinar or in the Facebook comments. Don't worry, we'll take care of bringing those comments to the participants here. Your questions will be addressed throughout the conversations by Dr. Nathalie Batraville, who's an assistant professor in the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, who will act as our moderator today. So without further delay, I hand it over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia is located on the land of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation in Tiohtià:ke. And I'd like to welcome everyone as well to this conversation, which will be a prelude to the event that will happen on May 1st to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Stella, which is an organization for sex workers by sex workers that aims to improve the lives and the working conditions of sex workers. The event was organized by Tigchelaar in collaboration with Shauna Janssen, who's the director of the Institute for Urban Studies. And in preparation for this conversation, I was reminded of an essay by Adrienne Marie Brown about facilitating events and conversations, in which she says, I quote, "There is a conversation in each room that wants and needs to be had. Don't force it, don't deny it, let it come forth." And in many ways, that's what Alex has done with this event. She's allowed a necessary and important conversation to emerge about the impact of COVID-19 on sex workers. And we're going to talk about the shift from an in-person event to an online event and the shift towards addressing the effects of the pandemic on sex workers. And we'll also talk about some of the practices and protocols that have been put in place to protect the agency of the participants and their consent and their safety, as well as some of the sort of overarching questions that Alex was asking herself as she was preparing to convene this event. And so I'd like to start by asking Alex and Shauna to introduce themselves and perhaps tell us how they met and started working together.
Do you want to go first, Alex?
Okay, so yeah, I'm Alex Tigchelaar. I'm the Research and Development Coordinator at the Institute for Urban Futures. I am a sex worker rights advocate, and I have been for over 25 years. And I am now a PhD student at Concordia in the humanities, and I study sex work in the urban environment, particularly in Montreal.
I'm Shauna Janssen. I'm the director of the Institute for Urban Futures and an assistant professor in theater at Concordia. And a lot of my research leading up to the directorship of the Institute has had to do with looking at overlooked forms of agency and unexpected agencies in the built environment. So really looking at ways to the ethics around how we do make the work of maybe not so much the experts or urban planners of the built environment, how we make that work and those agents and unexpected agents work visible. And Alex and I met many, many years ago, actually both working in theater, cabaret. We've crossed a lot of paths over the years. And so I just feel so lucky that Alex came back to Montreal and started the PhD, and that I get to work with her at the Institute.
Very same. Shauna and I worked at a theater in Toronto called Buddies in Bad Times Theater, which is, I guess, the only queer theater. It calls itself the only queer theater in North America, but both of us had a multitude of jobs there. We were both, I guess, born hustlers. So, yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for that, sort of introduction to yourselves and to your collaboration. I thought we could start by talking about the event that'll happen on May 1st and how you conceived it, and then also how you shifted to organizing the event online and the sort of significant changes that you've had to make to really support the participants' agency and consent and safety.
Okay, so we started out in collaboration with Stella because May 1st, well, first of all, Stella is celebrating 25 years of activism this year, and they're an organization in Montreal that supports sex workers to work with dignity and respect, and they do a lot of work around decriminalization. And so I really wanted to host a conference with them on May 1st because May 1st is International Workers' Day. And so that made a lot.
Did we just lose?
Looks like we hit a snag there and lost Alex for a moment. Let's see if we can bring her back. Maybe it's a bad connection that has happened. I think she's probably going to be trying to log back on any minute.
I can fill a little bit of the gap, I guess, quickly, and I'll stop as soon as Alex.
Oh, there she is.
There she's back.
She's
Okay.
back.
Okay, so here I am back. Thank you. That was odd. But you know, not we can deal with these sorts of things. So we had to pivot, obviously, since we cannot meet in person anymore, and many of the events of Stella were canceled. But as I was watching the organizations that I have done activism and advocacy and friendships with for many, many years, for decades now, pivot their services, continue supporting workers, keep a watchful eye on the police and their enhanced surveillance during this time, I thought we really, really need to do a conference about the work that sex workers are doing during this crisis, because they are, you know, truly leaders in what it is to work within their communities under duress when there are pandemics happening and under the criminalization of health. So it was really important to me to showcase these actions and the work that sex workers are doing at this time, and advocates and our allies. And so I contacted a group of advocates that I know, mostly in Montreal, but there's a couple who are based in Ontario anyway, and asked them if they would speak on their particular efforts, and everyone agreed. So that's how we pivoted. We did it quickly and efficiently, and Shauna and I had a few talks about it, and Shauna was very receptive to this change in the program.
Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could tell us about what are the specific concerns that emerge in organizing an event online, and how did you address those concerns? How did you try to put in protocols or practices to make sure that the participants' consent was really honored, as well as their concerns around safety?
Mm-hmm. So sex workers spend a lot of time in negotiations around consent and privacy, and as a result, we are experts at this, right? So it was really important for me when we were shifting this meeting online to do a poll of the groups and create solidarity and cohesiveness around issues around screen captures and tweets and who could record and so on. And of course, we sent the results of these responses to everyone who enters the room so that they're aware of our guidelines. And we reached out personally. We continue to reach out personally to everyone interested to let them know that these are our collective parameters. And I would, like I said, that's sex work methodology. We as sex workers are often under surveillance, whether it's virtual or it's on the street or it's community and so on. So we are experts at least considering protocols, right? And I think, they may seem unreasonable to a certain extent to some people, but to me, my argument would be that surveillance is unreasonable. And so we confront it with whatever tools we have at hand. So part of the rationale behind doing these safety protocols, where we ask people not to take screen captures, not to record, and there's various other things, is not necessarily as a means of addressing like general state surveillance in the internet per se, but like surveillance on a smaller but equally problematic scale. And by that, I mean like anyone from like a sociologist to a documentary filmmaker. So maybe people with research interests in sex work who are not necessarily engaging ethically with communities, unwittingly or otherwise, right? And so it was very important, first of all, for me to put these protocols in place so that the speakers would have an opportunity to say what was acceptable behavior for them in that room and what was acceptable documentation for them in that room. And then bring that out to the people who are interested, who are RSVPing. And part of that was an attempt to model good research practices, which for me is really important, you know, especially as someone who's doing work with sex work or who has experience in sex work, but also especially with a lot of young scholars who are applying to the conference through Concordia who are studying sex work. It was very important for me to model these kinds of ethics and let them know that sex workers have agency over the things that they want and do not want in public.
I think one of the things, if I can hop into this part of the conversation that was really interesting for me, and Alex and I talked about this too, leading up to this conversation, was when you're putting these protocols, or you're testing out different kinds of protocols and screening, as Alex is doing with the questionnaire, the sex worker methodology, how it affords us time to rethink some of the policies, protocols we already have in place as researchers. And so what does it mean then also when, you know, it's not really clear, cut and clear what is public about this and who this, let's say specifically this conference we're running on Friday is for. So this was one of the questions I was baiting Alex with, like, yeah, this is great. Like, we have got to explore these ethics and all the work that Alex put into generating this questionnaire, the thought into that was put into that, the one-to-one communication with the panelists who will be speaking on Friday, and then the one-to-one building, you know, on a micro relationship with people interested in participating and attending. I mean, the care that's being put into that is extraordinary and really inspiring. And then, so my question was also then, like, let's think about, you know, who is this for? And you know, and it's a hard question to answer. It's a question I'm always putting out there when we're doing work in with marginalized folk and communities. So this was really kind of, I think, also driving how you were, I think, in a way, shaping the questionnaire and the outreach on some level as well. But yeah, I would just...
Yeah, because as an institution, we have an obligation to disseminate knowledge. But we also have an obligation to hold space respectfully for communities that we engage with and study. You know, and we, you know, I see this already happening at Concordia. So at the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling and other spaces where there is space held for storytelling that is not necessarily just blown out into public, iggledy-piggledy, so to speak, but that people's privacy needs are met and considered in those spaces. And it's difficult to do, right? In an environment like the internet, which at its core is both public and also really ambiguous. And especially since sex workers have a very profoundly negative relationship with online surveillance and harassment. So these questions were, again, designed to honor the agency that sex workers are often perceived as not having, and that agency is often taken away from us through the construct of our work being naturally abusive, or also that people cannot consent to sex work. And in fact, we do an enormous amount of community care around these kinds of protocols all the time. But again, how to put those in place in a space where people, you know, maybe unwittingly practicing extractive practices around sex workers, right? Like, say, you know, someone who's a documentary filmmaker comes into the space and is just filming it because they see that as like an excellent opportunity to showcase the work that's going on, but without the consent or knowledge of the people involved in that. Well, we're letting that person know that we do not want that kind of documentation. And if they choose to do that work, there needs to be a collaboration. And those collaborations, we need to do more of that work with marginalized communities instead of just having these extractive purpose projects where we believe ourselves and know ourselves to be doing so-called good work, but again, often without the collaboration and consent of the people who are involved in that. We talk a lot about shining a light on the voiceless. And one of my favorite quotes is by Arundhati Roy: there's no such thing as the voiceless, there's only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And so we need to really think about the ways in which we enact and engage with communities, especially in spaces like the Institute for Urban Futures, where we have a mandate to engage ethically with people in the built environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. I think that part of what I found compelling as well in the way that you sort of thought of the space and thought of convening this event is also that you really conceived of the participants, of the sex workers, as knowledge producers, as opposed to simply as objects of study,
yeah.
as well as thinking about sex workers' bodies as living archives, as you were saying. And so I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about also how the sort of position that that each of the participants is in is also one that's a lot more empowering than what is traditionally the case is in academia.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I've known this as in an embodied sense, but also like with a scholarly eye, right? So many marginalized communities experience this asymmetricality of archives, and archives are often very, very asymmetrical and skewed when it comes to the documentation of sex work. And I've talked about legal documents, for example, which are highly distorted when it comes to the actual lived experience of sex work. So it's always important in all the work that I do to support the creation of an archive that supports the legitimacy and expertise of sex workers and our allies. And I would argue that sex workers are a living archive of so many socially and intellectually and everyday important subjects. So the city, as Shauna often points out, the right to the city, who has the right to the city. We are experts in public and private health because our bodies are sites of investigation and criminalization. We are experts in the arts because our bodies are sites of like fascination for artists of all stripes. We are often experts in the law too, because we live in criminalized bodies, and we are often in conflict and conversation with the law and the economy too, right? So our archive bodies, so to speak, our sex worker archive bodies are often in like ongoing tension and dialogue with all of these issues, but often without our consent and without our direct voices being represented. And so again, it's always very important for me to center, front and center, the real voices of sex workers, not just this kind of like sort of airy-fairy voiceless kind of community that exists, but the deliberately silenced voice, right? Like, I'll give you an example. When the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, which is the laws in Canada, was being formed in court, there was I guess you could call her a famous sex work prohibition in Canada, asked the senators to hear the silent voices of the people who were unheard, and she was using all of this florid language. But meanwhile, like no less than 40 actual sex workers had come to testify in this space, and yet their voices were completely erased in this, while she is kind of navigating this weird, liminal terrain of the voiceless. So again, it's extremely important to hold spaces for people who have lived experience and are allies to say these things, because we are faced, even when we do that work, with people who just completely erase those voices.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about some of the participants and partners in the conference. Who
Yes.
are the people who will be speaking, and why you've sort of chosen to put this set of folks together?
I'm very pleased with this curation. So we have Sandra Wesley, who is the executive director of Stella L'Ami de Mimi, and of course they're celebrating their 25 years this year. And Sandra will be talking about just the whole dynamic that happens when when there's a health crisis and certain people like the police and others become health experts. And once again, the sex workers are perceived as vectors of disease. So I believe that that's something that she will be addressing, but also the work that Stella continues to do on the ground. We have Anaïs Zeladon from Aztec, which is an organization that supports trans and drug-using street-based sex workers and how their services have pivoted. So they do safer using and sex kits, and they're also distributing meals. So she's going to be talking about the work that they are doing. You know, they're enhanced services, basically. We have Julie B from Safe Space London, which is an organization in London, Ontario, that has basically, like, the description that I got was that they have turned their storefront into a free Costco for sex workers. So sex workers can just go there and receive care and groceries and other services that they require. We have Jessica Kiano from Ishkwe, which is an organization through the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal that supports primarily Inuit women who are on the street and supports them in their engagements with the law. So Jessica is going to be talking about her community on the street and how they are functioning and how her services have changed. Alex Mcclelland is a scholar who just graduated from Concordia, actually, and his work is all about the criminalization of HIV. And he's been doing a broader look called Policing the Pandemic. He's created a map of all of the charges that have been laid across Canada in relation, COVID-related charges. And of course, many of those charges involve sex workers. So Alex will be talking, I think, more broadly about the criminalization of health and how policing pandemics actually is very, very problematic. So that's just a couple of the speakers that we have on board with us. Peyton Nash from Concordia, a young student from Concordia. She's fantastic. She's going to be talking about her own sort of smaller community response. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if we could sort of bounce off of the overview that you just gave us to maybe talk a little bit more about the sort of main theme of the conference, which is the impact of the pandemic on sex workers and the ways that this particular mode of criminalization is very much in line with policies and practices that were in place before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I don't know what you would call it. You're being doubly criminalized to a certain extent, right? So you were already existing in a criminalized body, and one now that currently cannot work. So how did, I'm really interested to hear how the communities, because many of them hosted fundraisers. So Elaine Lamb from Butterfly will be talking probably about the enormous fundraiser that they put together with Maggie's in order to support the workers who, you're criminalized for working before, and now you're really criminalized for working, right? Like you absolutely cannot work. And just the kind of surveillance that exists around, the double surveillance that exists around workers in this context, and the fines that you would face for continuing to work, even under great duress and poverty and so on. So I think that Elaine will be talking about that. But yes, I mean, again, like everyone has really pivoted their services to address the issues that an already criminalized community, an already stigmatized community is facing under a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And Shauna, these are sort of larger questions that the Institute and yourself have been interested in examining and thinking about for some time, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's just so great to hear Alex speaking again about her goals and vision for this conference. And, part of why the Institute for Urban Futures is supporting Alex's research and this collaboration with Stella and also these guests, these panelists, is because, one of our mandates is really, it's always been like the leading question for a couple of years has been, what does your urban future include? And
yes,
so how are we imagining through our research and research creation practices, how we imagine, more just sustainable urban futures? And that future includes as much of the present as it does the past, moving forward. And this is another conversation Alex and I have had about specifically in terms of the stigmatization around sex worker bodies, and kind of being stuck in the past, in the eye of the consumers, or the tourism that's created around that. So I think, you know, for me, the work of the Institute is really about lifting up and supporting as much as possible, amplifying the kind of work that Alex is doing. You know, and we've been very active in that and engaging with different kinds of publics around questions of public space. We've had a couple of collaborations already with Jessica from the Ishkwe, like who leads the Ishkwe project at Native Women's Shelter. So it is about I guess lifting those voices, and making space and figuring out what kind of space to hold to have these complex questions about the way that the built environment is shaped by all sorts of different stakeholders and users that are not necessarily kind of from that top down, very normative, patriarchal kind of planning that we do currently still live with. So that's a great interest of the Institute in terms of making space for this kind of work. And I think what's always struck me since Alex proposed to, we've talked about wanting to host this kind of collaboration with Stella for a while, and then there had to be this pivot. And I think what's been really important to me is, and what I'm looking forward to as well on Friday is understanding more of the leadership that Alex is speaking about in these communities. And you know, at the risk of sounding extractive, it's of course it's my curiosity engagement with, you know, what can we learn so that we can move forward in a really generative, caring way from these communities who are and these people who are working, excuse me, on the front lines. So that's really, because that's the kind of leadership that does get overlooked, right?
Yes.
And as you say, Alex, these pivots in creating these protocols. And, you know, we were talking about the mixed protocol. We all know that there's an Office of Research at Concordia, and we have these forms we fill out to if we're working with human subjects, and, you know, detailing all of those. And so I'm kind of wondering how, you know, this is kind of a bit of a, I guess from my point of view, a bit of an intervention on the side of like what, like how much more we have to think about and nuance our practice and the ethics of that engagement and how we build these relationships and collaborations. Mm-hmm. And I think part of what Alex set in motion with the sex worker methodology, the questionnaires, is there's a really good breadcrumb trail there right now that you've started, right? In terms of what else could this, like how could this, I mean, hold space in a more sustained way, potentially, for research, and how we ask ourselves. We always have to ask ourselves how we're doing what we're doing. That's part of our work. So this is, you know, I think really exciting and important and urgent work that Alex is bringing to the public and to the Institute.
Yeah, I'm very, very happy to be able to do it. And I'm very happy to have the support. It's helpful. You know, it really, really is. I mean that. And to be able to slow down the conversations too, right? Where it's not like we need to barrel towards this goal and we have to do this at all costs or whatever. Like to have the opportunity through the Institute for Urban Futures to take these steps, right? To be like, this week I'm going to do this and I'm going to send this out to the participants and I'm going to get a response from them and I will collate all of these things. And just moving, even though we had to do it quickly, we were moving at a respectful pace. You know, and again, like it wasn't everybody who was upset by the idea of having screen captures on Twitter and stuff like that, but a couple of people were. And so I created like a solidarity. It's like, so there will be none and that's it, you know?
Alex, do you want to say something a little bit about also this plan, like around the question of documentation? Because we have like a fabulous team at Urban Futures, and one of our team members, should I hand it over to you, Alex?
Yes, yeah. Okay, so Sadie Gilker is works with us at the Institute, and the Institute which makes me so happy, is it's housed in the fine arts department. And so there's always kind of, there's a creative aspect to all of the work that we do. We consider, arts in the urban space and so on. So one of the things that was really important to me, and always is, about the work that we do at the Institute for Urban Futures, is that there is a creative element to it. And so Sadie, who created the poster, actually, which is a mask umbrella, and the red umbrella is the symbol for sex work solidarity, is going to be live illustrating the conference itself. And then the plan is to create a PDF or a graphic novel style document in collaboration with the community, so that they would be able to look at the artwork and say, like, I like that, I do not like that, and so on, and then create some kind of documentation that we can have at the Institute, but that is also available to everybody who participates, that they can have for download on their websites as a PDF from the Institute for Urban Futures, so that they have a beautiful documentation of the activism, the really profound and groundbreaking activism. It is groundbreaking, like the work that Alex Mcclelland has done, policing the pandemic, the protests that they have put in place, the community engagement that they have engaged has prevented the police in Toronto's Allen Gardens from handing out tickets to people who live in that space. So people are literally doing groundbreaking work around sex work and other marginalized communities. And so for them to have a beautiful document of that is very important to me, and very particularly because you see so often sex workers mobilized in the arts in a way that again, is extractive, or it does not necessarily consider their own voices. So I am really excited because first of all, I mean, Sadie's work is beautiful, and because she draws in this neon style, it has a real kind of urban, a sexy urban feel to it. So I think that you can make urgent and important work and still have it like be beautiful and sexy at the same time. And I think a lot of sex worker rights organizations agree about that kind of perception that we create and put out ourselves, that we are culture influencers and culture makers, and that the culture that is not just made about us, but that we make ourselves, is beautiful and like badass,
Mm-hmm. I'd like, before I ask a follow-up question, I would like to encourage everybody who is listening and watching to ask questions to our fantastic panelists, either on Facebook in the comments or in the Q&A option on Zoom. Just thinking about this amazing document that you described that's going to be created and given to the participants, I was reminded of not only the question that Shauna asked, which is, who is this event for, but one that I often ask myself, which is, how will, in particular, a marginalized population benefit from this sort of convening this event, right? Like, what's in it for them? And so I think that you really showed that really beautifully, and wonder if you could say more, like how much that consideration played into how you organize this event. And then I guess another sort of connected question is, what intention or goals do you have for people who are not part of the sort of directly affected population, who might be participating or watching this event? Like, what do you want them to come out of this event with, if that was a consideration at all, which obviously it doesn't have to be?
Yeah, I mean, these are considerations for me. It's always very important for me. The work that I have done, my advocacy around sex work has always been creative. So plays and street-based theater, actions, stuff at art gallery and so on, because I do want people seeing sex workers taking back the means of production, basically, right? The means of reproduction. So it's important for me, for people who are not directly involved in sex work, but often have these very unnuanced opinions about it, that they receive, again, from archives, from from documentation that doesn't directly involve our voices, to see that these are communities that are leaders in health, that are leaders in city planning, that are leaders in activism, and that are leaders in law and economy and all of these things. Like, it's very, very important for me, for people who have had, I guess, distorted perceptions of sex work to have so-called access, I guess, to people with those lived experiences who are doing that work. Because I think also, you know, I believe this from the beginning of this pandemic, that sex workers and other marginalized communities would be leaders in community care. And I saw that happening from the outset when Stella's community was like organizing around getting, you know, alcohol wipes for their street-based people, when their outreach workers were encountering people who could no longer use the washrooms at McDonald's and Tim Hortons. So we were all going out and buying baby wipes and stuff. Like, I saw from the outset the kind of community caring response that other people can take a lot out of, you know, people who aren't necessarily attached to communities that require that kind of mobilization. The calm, again, and very badass, I'll just keep saying that, like the response is very, it's inspiring. And so I want people to have access and to see that kind of inspiring response, so that maybe they can apply a little of that methodology in their own lives, you know? And that's very important for me, for sure. But also, you know, the response has been, I mean, it's just been extraordinary and phenomenal. And I'm just like, I'm being fed by the exchanges that I'm having from healthcare workers, from street workers, from people who are involved in laws around marginalized communities. Like, the response has been extraordinary. People want to hear directly from sex workers about how they are dealing with this crisis. There's a real strong desire to hear.
Mm-hmm. So I think Anna was suggesting
breakout.
Sorry?
Breakout into questions.
Yeah, well, we're still hoping that that our participants would submit any questions. But so I have two questions. I'll ask the first one, which is so there are obviously some immediate responses and concerns that need to be applied to the particular crisis around food and sort of sanitization, sort of basic healthcare needs, as well as food. But I think that there is also, because you know, everything in our city and really around the world has stopped so significantly, I think there's also a desire to try to think about the world that will emerge after this pandemic to be possibly different from the one that we had before and that we currently have. And it's likely that will happen either way, right? Possibly we don't,
whether we like it or not. Yeah.
Exactly. So either in the context of this conference or of your own sort of reflection and thinking, is this something that's been on your mind, trying to think about how to use this moment or some of the necessary changes that could come out at this moment, either at the level of sort of policy or at the level of community care, as you were sort of describing?
Well, you know, it's kind of a hard thing to wrap your head around, but I do believe that this crisis has highlighted the disparities and also the real issues that people who already exist in criminalized and marginalized bodies already face, right? I mean, we're seeing that in long-term healthcare, where it's those problems have existed alongside of us for decades. You know, the issues and the exhaustion in those institutions have existed alongside of us for decades. The same thing with sex work. The issues that sex workers are facing now, that are now being highlighted. Like people are like, oh my goodness, people can't even work. You know, how are they changing their services? And most particularly, you know, when we're thinking about sex workers who have like precarious migration status and they can't apply for this funding, or, you know, all the issues that come around. Like Stella has done some work around, like, if you want to apply for the money, here's things that you need to maybe be careful about. Like they've done a lot of research on the possible economic problems that might come if you do apply for that sort of funding. But what I see is people being very, very aware that sex workers are real, that they exist in the city, that they exist in the world, that they're not just symbolic representations, right? Like that there is an actual crisis in that community that's unavoidable now. And people, I'm seeing a lot more empathy around the issues that sex workers are facing.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I'm just thinking maybe in a bit more of a broader perspective on this, to your question, Natalie, just about, you know, maybe a bigger reflection I'm having that ties into this is, you know, what's happened is certainly making me think a lot more about how interconnected we are. And you know, we talked a little bit about that slowing down and, you know, what kind of reparations, like, you know, there's so much suffering and loss going on right now, of course, but we are also, at least here in this view that I have, in, you know, in fairly privileged positions where we can take some of that time, and researchers too, right? To, you know, maybe not think about productivity so much, but how we are, I mean, this is something I'm thinking about a lot in terms of site-based work and socially and community engaged work and practices of care, and the meaning making of that, and the real sustainability that needs to come with that, both socially and economically and whatnot. That it's not about sustainability in building materials that is, you know, just going to hold up our cities when these kinds of pandemics arrive, because they will, they'll keep coming, we know that. So I guess my bigger reflection, but connected to this conference, is the importance of creating and holding these spaces in whatever way we can, where there's a connecting that's like through some kind of creativity and exchange, so that there's, you know, I suppose the sharing of these strategies, I know, is something that I'm interested in hearing more about on Friday. So I'm kind of going to this place of, you know, how we create these spaces for these strategies and sharing to happen in a meaningful way, and to kind of just slow it down a little bit, even within the urgency.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that is exactly, but there's always going to be these tensions that are actually all a part about holding these spaces, and how we can learn from how we share that kind of space and have those exchanges, if that makes any sense.
Well, I mean, I have to say that I'm curious to see, because one of the things that we as sex worker rights advocates in Canada have been fighting for decades now is the decriminalization of our labor. Like, sex work remains criminalized in Canada. And so I am wondering if people throughout this crisis, like if they are seeing that the criminalization of sex work, they're actually seeing the real issues coming to the fore around that with the pandemic, so that people cannot work and thus in a criminalized space maybe not apply for funding, that they are not getting the support that other workers have from the government. And so I'm wondering if that conversation will reemerge more in the public conscience than it is just within our communities.
Yeah, and I think also, Alex, something I'm just thinking about in this, you know, I hesitate to say this, but I do say it here and there, and you know, I think we're so driven in the many different things we do, whether we're in academics or in academia or not, or in the arts, to provide solutions when these crises happen. And it's not to say that a solution and a vaccine are not important. Of course they are. or people's safety or consent, and being clear about what that is and those parameters, and be able to create those frameworks and the methods to help us ensure those things. But we have to be careful, I think, too, about always being, driven to the solution, because then we miss out on this middle space where, we're in exchange and dialogue about different processes, that, doesn't necessarily mean that we are all in agreement or there is some kind of consensus. In fact, it's the more interesting thing for me, that this, as Chantal Mouffe would say, or to use her term, the spaces of agonism, and this census is actually quite transformative, right? If there's going to be real change. And so I'm a big believer in the kind of the agree to disagree, the practice of difference, creating different spaces of difference so that real transformation could take place. So I'm a big believer in that, more than I am around consensus, which of course is different than consent.
Yes, yeah.
To be clear about that. But I think that, I think that's part of the praxis. And I think, you really have curated a real space of agonism for these participants.
Well, and these are communities that we have been involved in struggles parallel to each other. So many of these communities, HIV/AIDS activists, researchers, sex workers, and so on, for decades, and there have been roles. Like, I'm not saying that this has been easy, okay? And it may not, again, like the whole solution-based thing, Shauna, I think is, may I say, patriarchal, but just, again, this idea that we can all come together, share knowledge. And that's so many of the people who have been RSVPing are just like, I'm somebody who has worked in public health, or, I'm a scholar in sociology, and so on and so on. I just want to hear what the sex workers have to say about this. I just want to hear what is going on in their communities, like how their services are holding up, what they're doing to support their communities, how police interventions have escalated. Like, people just really want to hear from workers. So again, providing a space where we can have those conversations that are not necessarily solution-based, but just provide people with some knowledge about what's happening.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to return to which you've been both discussing, the collaboration between sex workers and universities. And particularly in this instance, Concordia. And I wanted to ask the extent to which there might have been resistance or some frictions from either the side of the university or the side of the participants, and the extent to which you were able to address those or overcome those, whether through the mixed protocol that you instituted or through other means.
It's interesting being on both sides of this now, right? To have many decades of experience as a worker, but now also being in the institution. Like, how am I changing those hats, or underwear? But it comes from my experience navigating that space, comes from having made spectacular mistakes myself, as both an advocate, as a sex worker, as a new scholar. I have made mistakes, and I'm here to guide other people through recognizing those mistakes and also not making them. And also, again, through like the ethics of navigating those spaces, both as a worker and also now a scholar. The Institute and also Concordia, I have been very lucky to be surrounded by feminist scholars who are sex work supportive. So my thesis supervisor is Vivienne Namaste, Cynthia Hammond, and also Norma Rantisi. And these are feminist scholars who understand the economy of sex work, the culture of sex work. So, and Shauna too, there's been no blowback in that way, but definitely sex workers have had sometimes really discouraging relationships with the institution, right? Again, extractive relationships, people who don't ask for their consent when using data over and over and over again like that. I did that interview for an article like 10 years ago. Why is it coming up in your piece now, right? Like, just constantly
We actually have a question that you're essentially answering now, which sort of asks what are the specific ethical challenges that come up when people do research about or on sex workers. And so I think it's great that you're sort of outlining some of those pitfalls, some of those patterns that are recurrent.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's simply a problem with some researchers, they don't follow, and the thing is that you can follow proper guidelines and still be unethical, because sometimes the ethics protocols are to protect the institution and not the subject, the human subject, so to speak. So I think, I understand research is really, really important, but I also think that creating, again, these collaborative relationships where we can share support and share space and also recognize our responsibilities to communities in the urban environment, and that they are our equals. Like this is a relationship that needs nurturing, and we have a lot of institutional privilege, and I am so grateful to be able to use that to support and also provide space for the communities that I have been involved in for decades. I mean, but you make mistakes, and I know that I will make mistakes, but the thing is that I can be accountable to them, right? I can I'm willing to be accountable to the mistakes that I've made. And also, it's not the end of the world. Like, we have to know that too, right? That it's not, when you make those errors, the people in communities, marginalized communities, need to know that you're fallible too. Like, despite, all this sudden privilege I have as an academic, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to be make mistakes, or that I am not a new scholar, and that I have been in working communities for decades of my life, and so I'm learning these things as well. And I think for me, one of the things that I think is really important on both ends is a good faith practice. A good faith practice is really important.
Mm-hmm. So the follow-up question to the ethical concerns around doing research on / about sex workers was regarding the online aspect of this event, and whether it magnified those ethical challenges or instead offered a different set of ethical or, as we were saying, privacy and safety concerns.
Mm-hmm. So when we first began organizing this conference, again, I just very naturally apply sex worker protocol to any kind of event that I'm hosting. Like, where's the door? How many windows are there? Like, it's just a reflex for me at this point to consider the safety and privacy of participants, but also know, again, that sex workers can take care of themselves because they have had to for centuries. Like, I get that, I really, again, pity the poor person who walks into a room like that and tries to like take up negative space when there's a group of like ferocious feminist sex workers and their allies, right? I really I challenge them to do that. However, I very naturally take those things into consideration. So when we were organizing it in person, I found a great room on the 11th or 12th floor at the Hall building. And I'm like, oh, this is fabulous. We can have our lunch in here. The window, we can put like something over the window. We were doing the screening through Stella about people who were interested in coming in and so on. So those protocols were just very naturally in place. Like, how this transitioned to online, well, you can see, like, through the questionnaire, what people felt was acceptable to circulate in the moment, let's just say, because we are all also very aware that, like, oh, it's very important to have this work out there, but that photo of me is going to be all over the internet forever and ever and ever. Am I going to want that? So people just, we needed to consider those kinds of things. Again, people who, I'm so grateful that people are interested in this topic. But again, you have somebody who's like, I'm going to do a documentary on this, and I'm just going to extract all of this like knowledge and like record people in this and make a documentary without consulting those people involved. I mean, I just heard a woman speaking about an experience she had where she was interviewed when she was incarcerated, and this person had, like, without her consent, has made like a Netflix show about it. So all of those things just kind of swirl around, right? And so we need to consider what's going to happen with that information. And again, like, I'm not talking about state surveillance, you know, within the context of the internet. I'm talking about like smaller things that we can manage if we try, you know, and we can let people know when they come into that room that these are our rules. So that's how it shifted, basically. And just so you know, like in the conference that we were organizing in person, of course we had in our questionnaire, how do you feel about photographs? Like, again, like sex worker methodology all over the place, right? Like, so people had that option, like, absolutely not, don't you dare record me. Or, you know, yes, please, I can't wait to be all over the internet with my research and so on. So those protocols were in place in that context too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from a user in the Q&A on Zoom about the document that you're creating to archive the event. And Stephen says, and I quote, that that this idea, this project, this documentation project reminds them of the discussions that scholars like Wendy Chun and Shoshana Zuboff have been conducting concerning how we have moved from closed informational and data loops to systems that have non-ending and infinite layers of data sharing and surveillance in the name of corporate control and profit. What guerrilla tactics can we employ to disrupt and trouble the digital distribution systems and the collection of data that we are beholden to? What other sex worker activist methods can we learn from to disturb the background collection of data on digital platforms? And they add huge question, I know.
Well, I would be very curious to hear what they are doing. But one of the things one of the reasons why we are illustrating this rather than photographing it per se is that, you know, and I took this from Butterfly, the Migrant and Sex Worker Support Network. They illustrate a lot of their documentation. So when they take testimony from migrant sex workers who have been framed as victims of trafficking and then arrested and deported, they do illustrations of the women and their interactions with the police, because those interactions look very different than the ones of women being dragged out of massage parlors, being rescued, and so on. The interactions, like I said, the semiotics of those look very, very different. Well, simultaneously, they also protect the privacy of those women by not illustrating them rather than having like a photographic representation. So you can tell the truth in those contexts in a way that also protects the people involved in that. So illustration is a way to do that to me from the outset. But, you know, we also, many of the organizations that are speaking are people who have to speak publicly. It is their job to speak publicly about their organizations and the work they are doing. It is their job to challenge lawmakers and police. It is their job to have this information disseminated. How we choose to do that is up to us. What we put out there is up to us. And that is why we are not allowing any recordings, that we are recording it ourselves, and we are making the choice of how that looks, how it is written, and how it goes out afterwards. That's the difference. That is my guerrilla tactic. I would call that like a pre-guerrilla tactic. Like, I'm already ready in my outfit to spring out at you even before the shit hits the fan, right? So those are things, but again, that's sex worker methodology to me. It's like, what are you coming up against? What are you prepared for? And I get that from those communities. You know, I understand from the women at Butterfly that they prefer illustrations, both because they are more reflective of the real engagement with the police, not just this humiliating, horrible being dragged out of a massage parlor, the black thing across the face that implies from the outset that you are criminalized and like mortified and all of that stuff. Like, it gives you an opportunity to really literally draw on your real experience. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, Thank you. We're about to close. We have about 2 minutes left. So I'd love to hear sort of final concluding remarks, maybe starting with Shauna and then ending with Alex.
Okay, well, I mean, I just want to acknowledge that last question. It's a great question, and I'm by no means an expert in data, surveillance, capitalism, although the two names mentioned, I've just recently, in the last 6 months, have started to engage with both those scholars' work. And I mean, what's so interesting about, it's all about basically, you know, how your behavior and behavioral experience is somehow captured and potentially recirculated and whatnot. And I think, you know, one of my guerrilla tactics, which is really basically maybe more of a meta approach and to what Alex was talking about in terms of the more granular tactics, is really art. I mean, this is what's so great about art and its potential to be able to tell stories and truths that we can't otherwise do for whatever reasons, if it's about protection and privacy and all that. So I think that, and that's something we talked about. So I guess I would just say that is, you know, I'm just waving that big flag of art as a very powerful tool in terms of, and I know that sounds vague in this context, we don't have a lot of time, but I think that's part of what we've done by engaging Sadie Gilker, who is a graphic novelist and illustrator, to do this. And I would say, I guess, I just want to end on one last thing about going back to your question, Natalie, about the institutional support and negotiating some of institutions and supporting, negotiating that with the subject matter and our responsibilities as scholars in and outside of the institution. And that I would just say that, you know, the Institute for Futures is an enormous amount of support, both in the faculty and university level, to do the programming, work with the artists, researchers like Alex, that we really want to. So there's been an enormous amount of support for the programming we've done, and not like a lot to, there's not been a lot of contesting or negotiation that way. There's just been a really, really just, you know, great support. And I think working with Fourth Space and Anna, supporting this and bringing you on board and us being able to share this space together shows a lot about that support. Although I have lots of critiques of where I am in the world at an institution as well. But I did come across some writing around thinking about performing institutions and whatnot recently by someone named Elke van Kampen, who proposes this idea of a tender institute, which kind of can, you know, end up feeling a bit utopian. But what I love that she says about the Tender Institute is that it's what it is the institute that has become tender to the touch of its participants. And I'm happy to share that in another forum if that's interesting to people who are out there listening. But I think that's promising and hopeful in terms of moving forward with this kind of work and the fabulous, marvelous research that Alex is sharing with us.
Thank you. Thanks, Shauna. Yeah, I mean, thank you, Natalie, for I guess hosting us and asking these amazing questions. Like, it's been really provocative and a lot for me to think about going into this. And I'm really grateful for the Fourth Space for considering this in advance conversation. It's really important. I'm just really looking forward to Friday. I myself have, you know, I kind of left it open with the speakers, right? I chose them because of the work that they're doing, but we'll see, like, this changes from week to week, all of this stuff. So I'm deeply excited to hear what they have to say, and I'm really excited to share that information with everybody who has like a stake in this issue. All of the people who have replied have a real stake in that knowledge sharing. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, if I can pipe in here, everyone, thank you for those very generous, sorry, fourth space shout outs. I know if I speak on our behalf, I'd say that we could probably listen to you all day in this engaged dialogue, and we're super pleased to be able to facilitate this conversation and kind of be part of it in the background as well. Natalie, thank you so much for the time and energy that you've
Yes, thank
invested in
you.
this. It was really great to have also your insights and perspectives. And to both of you, we wish you great luck, I guess, and just a kind of great, I think, event on Friday. For those of you attending who would like to learn more about what's happening on May 1st, I think I will invite you to visit the Institute for Urban Futures website to get more information as to what the conference will involve, all the speakers involved, and also how you might be able to attend. And also on that note, please don't forget to follow up with what Fourth Space is doing, because this is exactly the kind of thing that we're interested in, facilitating these kinds of conversations, hosting workshops, and a variety of panels around various questions. So check us out at See You at Fourth Space to keep tabs on that, or our website, concordia.ca/4. And for now, we will say goodbye so that you can all join me outside in your own respective outdoor spaces to get some of this sunshine. Again, thanks everyone for being here, and until next time, we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Natalie.
My pleasure.